and thanks for the organizers for inviting me and also being flexible with their schedule. I have to leave a little early. So I'll talk about fast and memory efficient. And memory efficient is actually, we get memory efficiency by being sparse. So in some sense, it's the right title for this workshop. But I will not induce sparsity in a way you might think by using the regularizer. So we'll see how we actually look in forced sparsity. This is joint work with my former postdoc, a bunch of students, and some other faculty members who work in computer networking and parallel computation. Okay, so this work was originally motivated by analyzing, the goal was to analyze very large social networks. And there are other networks that I'm interested in. For example, we're working on a problem where we look at biological networks, where we have links between genes, diseases, phenotypes from different species. And what we want to do is find links between genes and diseases. But today I will focus, you can think of the prototypical application as social network analysis. So, they're huge, scalability is a big issue, and one needs to solve various predictive problems. So you need scalable algorithms. So, I probably will not present results today on networks of size 750 million vertices. What we will do is, for today, we will consider networks of about 3-4 million vertices, 100 million edges. That's the largest we've been to. But we can run our algorithm in parallel, and we can hopefully scale up. Okay, so when I say large, it's about that order of magnitude. 3-4 million vertices, 100 million edges. So pretty big. So, well, social networks, nodes represent people typically, edges represent relationships. And this is a small network that was studied by sociologists in the 60s or 70s, I forget. It's the Karate Club network. The nodes represent each of the 34 people in the Karate Club. And node 1, I believe, was the lead instructor. And node 34 was the student founder of the Karate Club. And these are communications between the people outside of the Karate Club. Okay, so these were recorded, and it turned out that they were reflective of conflict in the Karate Club. And it turned out that after a while, the club actually split up into two. And if you do a structural analysis of this network, you could actually find the conflict. So, social network analysis, today I'm just concentrating on structural properties. So what one might want to do in social networks? Well, one may want to try and estimate proximity measures between people or between the nodes, even though they may not be directly connected. They may be at varying distances. You may want to detect communities. You may want to try and distinguish between relationships that are strong or relationships that are weak. There have been people in sociology who studied these things. And then the predictive tasks is, for example, many of you are probably on Facebook and you have friend recommendations on Facebook. So predicting who will become whose friend in the future. If you're in the biological application, you may want to predict which gene is likely to be linked to which human disease. And so there was, so this is just a small cartoon of a link prediction problem. I'm not spending too much time here because I want to get to the technical part soon. So here, at time instant 1, only Alice and Eve are friends, then Dave and Bob become friends, then Alice becomes a friend with Bob, the network evolves, and the question is at the next time step, do you want to, what recommendations do you give to Carol as to who her likely friends might be at the next time step? Okay, so there are many models that exist. Companies like Facebook normally look at common neighbors, which can actually be computed using the square of the adjacency matrix. They, of course, don't just look at the static graph. They have many other sources of information, like profile information, so they can augment a square with that information. Okay? And then there are some more involved measures like the catch measure. So there was actually a nice paper exactly about a year from now that was published in Science Review, which said that you can look at adjacency matrices, and then you can look at functions on these matrices, and that can give you information about the network properties. Okay? So our adjacency matrix is Wij if there is an edge between node I and j, so this could be a weighted adjacency matrix. For now, we'll assume that Wij is positive. But there are cases where Wij may be negative when you actually have not only friendship relationships, but enemy or distrust relationships. Okay? That does occur in practical life. So like I said, a squared, if you look at a squared and you look at the ij element, then it counts the number of walks of length 2 which are between I and j. So that's the number of common neighbors that I and j have. And you can extend that to look at a higher power of a that gives you a length of longer, a walk of longer length. So then you can do things like you can look at the matrix exponential, which is a power series, and you can combine paths of different length, and then you typically downweight them exponentially. So the most famous one in sociology is this measure, which is called the Katz measure, that takes paths of length 1, 2, 3, 4, but damps them exponentially. And so this is what is called the Katz measure. Okay? And Estrada, who is one of the authors of the first author of this paper, is particularly high on the matrix exponential. I don't think, well. And then what the paper says is that you can look at things like centrality, and you can try and approximate it by looking at the matrix function and looking at the diagonal elements. That tells you in some sense how important the particular node is. And then you can look at communicability, which is how much information flows between I and j, as look at the matrix function. So remember, this is a matrix function. So the input is a matrix, the domain is a matrix, and the output is also a matrix. F of a is itself a matrix. For example, I minus beta a inverse, the resolvent, or the matrix exponential. Okay. So you can try and compute this matrix and then look at the ijth element, and then you can try and compute a quantity that a lot of people who do social network analysis are interested in, something called Betweenness, and that you just perturb the matrix a little bit by removing a node or an edge, and you see how the matrix function changes. So that's very nice, but of course, if I have a network of size 3 million, then it's going to be very hard to try and compute f of a fully. Okay? Because even though A is a sparse matrix, f of a is going to be a dense matrix. Okay? There is this anecdotal thing where we are all there are 6 degrees of separation between us, so if you think about it, a to the power 6 is going to be nearly dense matrix. Okay? So there's really no hope of trying to compute it exactly. So what should one do? Well, one simple thing to try and do, one first thing one might think of doing is think of a spectral approximation. Okay? So here, assume that A is symmetric. You look at the largest k eigenvalues and eigenvectors, largest in magnitude of eigenvalues. And then the nice thing is that these matrices are orthonormal. V is a tall, thin matrix. It just has the top k eigenvectors. And I can approximate e to the power a by v e to the power lambda v transpose. Okay? So the function goes inside because v is an orthonormal matrix. And so this one can do. If one uses an algorithm, let's say like the Lanchos algorithm, okay, then one can compute for 3 million vertices. You can, let's say, compute k is 200 or 300. You can do that. It might take a fair amount of time. But after you've done that pre-processing, you can compute these matrix functions or approximate them without that much difficulty. But is that the right thing to do? Okay. We know that the SVD is optimal in some sense, right? There is the so-called Young-Eckhart theorem that says that if you look at all rank K matrices, the K truncated SVD gives you the best rank K approximation in either the spectral norm or the Betweenness. Okay. But let me argue that in this case, it's not the best thing to do. So, since I started doing research on this, I said, I should probably try and get on Facebook. Okay, just because so I know a little bit of what's going on. So I went on Facebook, but then I didn't want to spend too much time on it, so I have 2 friends on Facebook. My wife, and then her mother sent me a friend request, so I couldn't say no. So I have 2, but there are 750 million people on Facebook. My wife, on the other hand, was, I think a year or 2 ago, was on a tear to have the most number of friends that she could get. So she, contacted a pen friend who she was friends with in Thailand, and she was able to connect. But, she has 400 friends after that, 400 or 500 friends. If you think about 500 friends versus 750 million people, this matrix is extremely sparse. Okay? There are many, many, many zeros in this matrix. So, so the SVD you can think of as an alternate representation of this sparse matrix. But the SVD, the singular vectors, are going to be dense. There's not going to be that many zeros in the singular vector, and that in some sense comes about from the very nature of singular eigenvectors or singular vectors. Right? There is this nested orthogonality property, and that orthogonality property in most cases comes up because of cancellation, not because of structure. So here is an example, graph that we took from Light Journal, 3.8 million vertices, the average degree is 17, so very small. It requires about 1 gigabyte to store the adjacency matrix if you, for example, load it as in MATLAB as a sparse matrix. Okay? But if you do a rank 100 approximation using the SVD, it takes 100 gigabytes, no, 6 gigabytes. Okay? So it's clearly not a compression. Okay? But I don't necessarily just want the best compression. I want to be able to approximate matrix functions. Okay? So the problem is that the SVD allows you to compute matrix functions, approximations to them, but does not preserve sparsity. Okay? So what should we do? So here is, in some sense, one of the key slides of this talk. Okay? You know that the SVD is the optimal in rank. Okay? So if I fix a rank, let's say 500, and I look at the reconstruction error, I think this is in Betweenness norm. Okay, I have the SVD. If I have any other method, no matter how clever I am, that has rank 500, the method will yield an approximation error that is worse than this. So the SVD necessarily, in some sense, has to be the lowest. There's a theorem and there's a proof. It's correct. But if I change the game, if I say I'm not going to measure the compactness of my representation by the rank, but I'm going to measure it by the amount of memory that I use to store the representation. Okay? Then we have a method, which I will talk about, that can substantially increase or make better the approximation. Okay? And so this says that this shows that in that metric, okay, where you're trying to measure, so this is someone said, well, someone asked me, is this optimal? And I don't know. And the question is whether this can actually be somehow characterized information theoretically, where not only do you want good coding, but you also want to be close to the set of low rank matrices. Okay? So the SVD has a particular rank. We are also, the new method also gives low rank, but our basis vectors are going to be sparse. And hence, we are better in memory.
So your rank is higher, but you're sparser.
It is higher, but it's sparse. Exactly.
Do you know, or is there a reason not to compare, or does it compare well with something like CUR, which is low rank?
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Do you know that?
Yeah, we've done some of those experiments, and we are better in this metric. Okay, but we need to do some more. Yeah, we need to do more experiments.
The rank for your method was what you were plotting on the left, or is that not the rank?
Yeah.
What you see on the left is the rank for your.
Yeah, but so our method for a certain rank, why don't I go to my method and then things will become clear. Okay? So this is sort of just giving you an idea. So one of the core components, key components of the method is we are dealing with large social networks. There is a community structure in these networks. So the first thing that we will do is do a very, very fast clustering of this network. Okay? And when I say clustering, I'll detect communities. And I did work about 5 years ago with some students of mine, and we developed some software that can handle very large networks very quickly. So that is going to be a key ingredient of our method. So here is, for example, this is actually the actual split in the karate club, and if you use most reasonable clustering algorithms, they'll recover this, except I believe for node 9. And node 9 ended up being, you know, there's the whole story behind it. He or she was 3 weeks away from getting a black belt, so he or she stuck with the instructor. So how do we do graph clustering quickly? Well, there are various ways to cluster the graph. There's something called ratio cut, which came up in the circuit community. More recently, normalized cut was used for image segmentation, proposed by Shi and Malik. And these are, in some sense, weighted graph cuts. Okay? So they are trying to minimize the cut between partitions, but at the same time, they don't have an explicit restriction on the node sizes, but that is brought about implicitly by having some normalization. Okay? So the normalization over here is by the sum of all the edge weights that are incident on a partition. So traditionally what people would do, for example, Shi and Malik, the method they suggested was to use eigenvectors of the normalized Laplacian and use that to try and optimize it. Okay? These are all NP hard to optimize. What we did a few years, but that can be a little bit expensive, spectral methods. Okay? Because that also requires computing eigenvectors. What we've done about, 4 or 5 years ago, was to develop a software which was in the same spirit as a package called NIPS. So NIPS is a package that's used very heavily in circuit applications and other applications. And what it does is it takes the input graph, very quickly coarsens it by merging edges. So the hope is that we have n vertices at one level, coarsen it, we get n divided by 2. That's the hope. And n divided by 4. And keep on doing it until you get to a small graph. Then you do an initial clustering or partitioning over here, and then you somehow lift this partitioning, keep on lifting it up and up. Midas used Kearney and Lind algorithm with a lot of tweaks, and then you get a final cluster. What Midas was trying to do was to minimize the cut such that the number of, so that each partition size is of the same size in terms of the number of vertices. But that is not natural in social networks. So what our method does, this method that I referred to before, it actually shows that, for example, the normalized cut objective is equivalent to something called weighted kernel k-means. And when I say equivalent, I mean exactly mathematically equivalent. The objectives are identical with a certain kernel. And then what we can do is we can use the same strategy. We can coarsen the graph, and then when we lift the partitioning, so we do an initial clustering, when we lift the partitioning, we run weighted kernel k-means. And what that does is it takes an input partition and improves its quality. Okay? So, and the nice thing about this method is that it is extremely fast. And that was in some sense a requirement that I wanted to have before we started this work. Okay? Because we were handling graphs of very large size. So here is an example. I forget how big this is. This is maybe about 400,000 vertices. So if you use our software, this is a spy plot originally with no ordering. Spy plot, if you order using our software, you can see that the clusters are of different sizes. And here is Midas, where the clusters are about the same size. Okay? And so you could reorder your adjacency matrix according to the partitions in which they happen. And what will happen is that the diagonal blocks A11 through ACC, if you cluster into C clusters, will be heavier in the sense that there will be more edges within these partitions. but not that there will be insignificant amounts. So over here, let's see, 80% are within the partition, but then 20% are outside the partition. So here is what we do. So we will...
That number is averaged over all 10, whatever the number of partitions is? The edge is 80% or inside?
Yeah, this is all
All
overall.
those clusters is 20% point out. That's that number.
So what we do, the method is, let me see, maybe I should just talk about the method. Okay, so the method is the following. Okay, so we'll cluster the graph very quickly into C clusters. We'll compute a low rank approximation of the subgraph. Okay, and we can either use the SVD or we can use stochastic low rank approximations. Okay, and once we have that, we will then try and compute the relationships between the different clusters. Okay. And so one way of looking at this is that, and so this explains why we are more memory efficient. Okay. So suppose I have clustered into 3 clusters. Okay. And this is, let's say, the SVD. Okay. So let's suppose this is 1 million and this is 10. Okay. And this is also 10, but this is now going to be 3 times 10, 30. So we have a rank 30 approximation. SVD gets a rank 10 approximation. But we have zeros over here. So it is a basis which is sparse by construction. Okay? And as a result, the memory that is needed to store this is exactly the same as for SVD. The only extra we pay is for this diagonal matrix, because, sorry, this inner matrix, which is no longer diagonal, but is going to be dense. And we form it by looking at the best least squares approximation one can compute. Okay? So that is the algorithm. So this Sij is compute the relationship between the clusters. So I don't think I have time, but what one can show is what do you do within each cluster. You can either use SVD or you can use stochastic low rank approximations. You can actually do anything within each partition. And if you use stochastic low rank approximations and you start with, for example, a random Gaussian matrix, you can extend the bounds that you get in that case to when you cluster. Okay? So there's a little bit of analysis. I'm not going to go into the detail, where you can bound the error in expectation. Okay. So here are some results. So 3.8 million vertices, 65 million edges. If you use the SVD, the relative error is given over here, and if I use 117 clusters, the reason why these numbers are slightly odd is because we keep on doing the clustering until each partition becomes below a certain size. Each subgraph is below a certain size. Okay? So we see that we are actually, SVD, we are much better than the SVD in terms of reconstruction. Now you may ask, what does reconstruction error have to do with the application? So let's go to that, but before that, networks, you can say, why stop at one level? Because networks have this hierarchical structure. I can take each cluster, each subgraph, and repeatedly cluster it. And you can see that there is a nested structure within these networks. So one can actually do this trick in a hierarchy, okay, where I can think of these as the 2 diagonal blocks of my matrix A, and these are the 2 diagonal blocks of my matrix, the top left corner of the matrix. Okay? And then I need to get an approximation at each level. So suppose I get basis vectors over here. Then, if you note, I will actually have 2 clustered low rank, 2 approximations. One which is obtained from this level, and one which is obtained from this level. So this would be level 1 is what we call A sub 1. And then level 2 is going to think of this as having 4 clusters. Okay? And then I can run my approximation algorithm for each of these levels. The issue is, how do I actually compute these quantities? So if I have a parent and I have 2 children of the parents, and if I'm giving a low rank approximation over here and over here, how do I compute this? So one is, you can say, I'm not going to touch the basis, I'm just going to take a direct sum of the basis. Okay? But then the rank will increase. The rank will become 2k. Or the other extreme is that I can just do a rank k SVD right here, starting from rank. But it turns out that neither is a good idea, because if you look actually at the subspace which is obtained from the subgraphs, then it actually is not too far away from the subspace of the full graph. Okay? When I talk about the subspace, I mean the rank A truncated SVD of the full space. So I know I'm going pretty quickly.
So you just use that direct line because the spaces are close.
No, we don't use the direct line. So this is the algorithm that we use. So given the subspace approximation for the children, we basically just run q steps. We really need q equal to 1 of subspace iteration followed by orthogonal projection onto the resulting subspace. It's actually the exact same procedure that Traub, Martinson, and Halko use in their papers, except they start with a Gaussian random matrix, but we have a good approximation of the subspace, and so we start with this matrix. Okay? And it turns out we have results that show that if you start from random and you even do 5 powers, we are still able to beat that by using the approximations at the children. Okay? But what's more interesting is that instead of just using, so I could think of that as just computing an approximation for the entire graph. But you can actually get multiple approximations of the graph which are at different scales. Okay, so A0 is the whole matrix or whole graph. A1 is the approximation obtained from the first level. A2 is the approximation obtained from a deeper hierarchy. A3 is the approximation obtained from a still deeper hierarchy. So what one can do is actually combine this to do a multi-scale prediction. So you can combine all these different multi-scale representations that you have of the graph and then combine it, for example, to give you the CAT score. So let me just give you one example. So I showed you the karate club network. It has 78 edges. So suppose I do a leave one out experiment. Okay? So leave one out means that I will remove an edge and then I will use some predictive method and then see where that edge is ranked in my prediction. Okay? So traditional methods like what Facebook uses if it just had the graph would be common neighbors. Okay? So let me just explain this. The y-axis is number of hits. So the x-axis is top k. So this says I have 78 experiments because I am doing 78 leave one out experiments. And this says that this is 9. So this says that in 9 of those 78 leave one out, the edge that I deleted was ranked first. Okay? And this is top k, and so this is the number of hits. Okay? So obviously higher the curve, the better it is. So if I use common neighbors, then I get this graph. If I use, if I did not do any sophisticated clustering and just divided things up randomly, okay, then I would get actually something worse. If I use CATs, which looks at walks of different lengths and combines them by forming I minus beta A inverse, then I get the green curve. If I just use our method, but just with one level of partitioning or clustering, then I get this level, this plus. But if I use this multi-scale prediction, so think about it, think of what it does. It partitions, and we use 3 levels over here. It partitioned the graph, the karate club, into 2, 4, 8. And then it formed an approximation from each of these partitions. So I have representation of the approximation of the graph at 3 scales. And then I use that and combine it like I said in the last slide. And as a result, we get much better, better and more robust predictions. Okay, so that was of course the toy network. This is 30,000 nodes, 684,000 edges. And this is the false negative rate with false positive rate. And you can see that our curve, the new method is over here. So it's better. Larger, 1.7 million nodes, 84 million edges, and we have different time steps, so we are trying to predict in the future who the friendships would be. Again, the multi-scale prediction helps. I don't have time to talk about it, but I'm just going to say this method is in some sense very easily, well, not very easily, but it's meant for parallel computation. Right? I take my big graph, I divide it up into different parts, I do something local in each part, then I combine it. So once I've divided the graph up, everything is easily parallelized. The question is whether you can parallelize a division and getting together. Okay? And it turns out we can parallelize, the getting together part very easily. The partitioning actually does not take that much time. So just to give you a sense of the times involved, let's see, 3.8 million vertices, 128 processors, takes about a minute to do it. Okay? And we get speed ups of about 8. Okay? Go to a larger graph, about 10 million vertices, it does everything under 8 minutes, but the speed up goes down. So it turns out that the partitioning software is very fast, but it doesn't necessarily scale that way. Okay? So as we get bigger and bigger, the scaling of that part needs to be improved. Okay?
Is that the bottleneck, the partitioning, not the combining the eigenvectors for the video?
No, because those speed up. So here is a sort of a plot of the times. Right? So for example, when you do, let's see. So on 128 processors, the partitioning time is the most, and the combination time is actually not that good. Right? So that does start, but we are still able to handle 100 million. What did I say? 10 million vertices. So okay, so that's the end. I'm sorry I had to rush through a little bit. I've given this talk in an hour, but. So what I've done is the goal was to try and compute or approximate matrix functions. So how can you get a dimensionality reduction scheme that allows you to do matrix functions and at the same time the basis is somewhat sparse? Because that helps in memory efficiency. So the approach we took was, instead of trying to use an optimization-based method where we try and have a regularizer and then run an optimization algorithm, we explicitly enforce the sparsity by doing clustering. So it's by no means optimal, okay? But it does scale to the size of problems that we want to scale. So it is memory efficient, it is parallelizable. I've said some things in future work. I presented you some preliminary future work. This notion of doing a multi-scale approximation of the graph and then using multi-scale prediction to get better results, that seems to be quite a powerful idea. And so we'll pursue that in the future. And if we really want to scale up to 750 million vertices, we have to develop some better partitioning algorithms. Okay, that's the end of my talk, and there are some references out here. Not all of them mine, but if you're interested in network analysis, I read this book by Easley and Kleinberg. It's a very well-written book, very well-written book. So if you're interested in that area, I would say you should read that. Okay, thank you.
We have time now for maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Is there an optimal number of clusters to use? I imagine as you increase the number of clusters, it must start becoming too sparse to be useful.
Yeah, at some point of time. But the size of the matrices that we've tackled so far, I mean, you're right that we should do some experiments where we start getting worse results. But right now we don't have any model selection criteria. So we should do those experiments. Question?
Yeah, so we initially showed that reconstruction error, you guys do better for a certain amount of memory compared to regular SVD.
Yeah.
But in the later experiments, you actually showed other metrics other than reconstruction error.
Yes.
Did you try that using just vanilla SVD as well?
Yeah, we do that.
And you do that?
Yeah.
Maybe I missed that on that. Is that?
It's not in the slide, but it's in the paper.
You do a lot better.
Yeah, we do. Because it turns out actually you need a fair amount of rank out here. The rank has to be substantially large to get decent results. Yeah.
In statistical applications, you might imagine that you don't have the exact adjacency matrix, so you have a noisy copy. Do you have any sense about robustness of these things to different kinds of noise and estimated adjacency matrices?
I mean, so this is it's a great question. Right? So if you look at my plots, the amount of, there is no natural place where I can actually make it low rank. So there's no sharp drop off in the single reference. So some might even question, why are you using low rank approximations? But it turns out that when we do experiments like prediction accuracy, then we actually perform better than using the initial matrix. But then one can say is that the initial matrix itself is noisy. Like, why did I, not accept your friend request and accepted someone else's friend request? So in that case, you could say that the initial process itself was somewhat noisy. So you would think that this multi-scale prediction would actually be more resilient to noise.
So that's all the time we have. Thank you.